In most of our human endeavors, we require mechanics and engineers. In virtually every industry, the synergy of those who develop and those who maintain and refresh, and then back to those who advance and develop anew, allows for the cycle of human advancement to continue. We need mechanics to keep our cars and boats and trains and planes not only functioning, but functioning well. And yet we need engineers to initially discover and develop the technology, and then develop newer technology so that we can be more efficient and more functional. As plastic surgeons, whether or not we focus on cosmetic surgery or anti-aging, we are looked upon by our patients, communities, and globally as anti-aging experts. But are we? Do we really have a level of expertise on the whole subject, or do we really have a relatively narrow focus? I dare to say that we are all basically mechanics. As I mentioned before, all thriving industry need mechanics, but we also need engineers. As cosmetic surgeons, we grease the skin up with ointments and lotions. We shine it up with lasers and peels. We fill it up with hyaluronic acid and fat. And when parts get too loose, we cut away the excess and tighten it up. But as experts, should that be the extent of our knowledge, our practices, or our aspirations and visions? The successful anti-aging of our shell can only be truly maintained if we focus on our core. I'm not talking about eating right or exercising or minimizing stress, although I'm not invalidating that either. What I'm talking about is how can we engineer on a molecular level a cure for the disease of aging? As Dr. deGrey will educate us on, aging must be looked at as a disease. And once we look at it that way, perhaps we will find a way to cure it. Imagine if we could cure the diseases of aging. Cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, peripheral vascular disease, osteoporosis, arthritis, collagen degradation. Not only could we live longer, but we could live better. But to achieve that, we need to not just be mechanics. We need to be engineers. I first became knowledgeable of Dr. deGrey a couple of years ago when I was looking at TED Talks. Born and raised in England, Aubrey deGrey is an author and biomedical gerontologist and co-founder and chief science officer of SENS Research Foundation. SENS standing for Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence. He is the editor-in-chief of the academic journal Rejuvenation Research and author of the mitochondrial free radical theory of aging, for which he received his Ph.D. He is also the co-author of this book entitled Ending Aging. He is known for his view that medical technology may enable human beings alive today to live indefinitely. Dr. deGrey's research focuses on whether regenerative medicine can indeed prevent the aging process. Dr. deGrey is an international adjunct professor of the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology, a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America, the American Aging Association, and the Institute of Ethics and Emerging Technologies. He's been interviewed in numerous news sources, including 60 Minutes, the BBC, the New York Times, Fortune magazine, the Washington Post, TED, and on and on and on. But for the most part now, he is based out of Northern California, where his work is centered on a detailed plan for strategies for engineered negligible senescence, which is aimed at preventing age-related physical and cognitive decline. I guarantee you will find what he has to say enlightening. So please welcome Dr. Aubrey deGrey.
Wow, that was a lovely introduction. So I'm delighted to be here. I always love coming to LA, but I also always love speaking to new audiences, and I understand that this is a relatively unusual audience for me. I don't normally speak to medical professionals, and actually that's where I would like to start. Let me see whether I can make this work as a laser pointer. Yes, good, okay. So there are two things on this title slide that I want to start by drawing your attention to. And essentially my purpose here in the first few minutes will be to say more or less what Peter said by way of explaining to you why this next half hour will not be a waste of your time, but in a slightly different way. First thing is, I'm a Ph.D., not an M.D. I am one of those people who, figures out things that don't yet exist. Secondly, I am the Chief Science Officer of a foundation, a non-profit, a 501c3 based up in Mountain View, California. So in those two senses, I am really not one of you. I mean, I know that most of you are, you're medics and you run your own practices by and large, as far as I understand it. You're all about doing well by doing good, and I'm really very much in favor of that. But a lot of people who are in that position presume, initially anyway, that basic research that's done in a non-profit environment is not really your problem. You'll worry about it when it becomes less basic. And that's very understandable. But I want to emphasize that the stuff I'm going to tell you today is very practical. It's not practical today. In other words, it's not something that's going to change what you do tomorrow when you go into work. But it very well may change. In fact, I think it's highly likely to change what you do 10 years from now when you go into work. And that is something which I hope I'm going to be able to convince you that you should be thinking about now. Because at the end of the day, the people who do well by doing good are the people who do the best good. And those are the people who are best informed and anticipate future developments more accurately. So I'm going to be talking a lot about the developments that you can expect to see in the coming years that will alter the range of options that you have for treating patients and that you would profit from understanding before your competitors do. I'm going to start by telling you what I think aging is. And actually, I'm not going to do what Peter perhaps expects me to do and tell you that aging is a disease, but I'm going to come fairly close to that. But I'm going to do it in a roundabout way. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to emphasize that aging is not actually a phenomenon of biology. It's not just living organisms that age. Inanimate machines age too. Any machine that has moving parts gets old. And the thing that I want to emphasize is that the mechanisms by which it gets old, of course, differ in detail from one machine to another and from non-living to living machines. But at the end of the day, the underlying process that causes aging to happen at all is the same. It is simply a fact of physics, of thermodynamics, that any machine with moving parts is bound to generate damage, to inflict damage on itself as an intrinsic, unavoidable side effect of its normal operation. So all machines are set up to tolerate a certain amount of that damage, and that's why machines last a certain amount of time without any maintenance or any significant maintenance. But eventually the damage accumulates to a point where the machine can't cope with it, and that's when performance declines and eventually ceases entirely. And that is exactly the same for a car or a human being. The specifics of what damage is done differ, of course, and we'll go into that shortly, but the essence of aging is exactly the same, and that turns out to be a very important thing to keep in mind. So now if we go to biology, of course we can use perfectly familiar terms. Metabolism, which I'm using in the strict sense to mean the entire network of processes that the body performs in order to keep us alive. I don't just mean oxidative metabolism. Metabolism creates damage throughout life, even starting before we're born. That damage accumulates and accumulates, and eventually there's too much of it, and late in life the damage exceeds our tolerance, and we get the pathologies of old age. This is the same as the previous slide, except for the arrows. The idea is to attenuate the arrows, to try to slow down the process that goes from being alive to being dead, so that being dead happens later. And, that's what we want to do. But unfortunately, people have gone about it in a very poorly thought out manner over the years. I'm going to start, in order to explain that, by, again, stepping back a little way and asking a question. And the question is, why have we been so much less successful in the postponement and the alleviation of the various diseases of old age than we have been with regard to the diseases that used to be so prevalent early in life? I mean, let's face it, 200 years ago, more than 1/3 of babies would die before the age of 1. And they would die from things like tuberculosis and diphtheria and such like that virtually nobody in the industrialized world dies of today. So we've been rather successful. And yet we still got these things that everyone who got to the age of 70 or 80 200 years ago would get. They still get them at not much later in age. It's pretty bad news. Now, most people would say that this is the reason why that's the case. Don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read this slide. It's, it's just to emphasize that an awful lot of things go wrong with us late in life. And in particular, this is to emphasize the fact that those things tend to go wrong at more or less the same time, which means that, of course, they interact, they exacerbate each other, and the sheer complexity of the situation is very daunting. So many people would say that this is fundamentally the reason why medicine has failed to get on top of aging the way it has got on top of most infectious diseases. And there's some truth in that conclusion. That is certainly part of the answer. But it's actually not the main part of the answer. In order to explain the main part, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you for your opinion of the question, in what general ways, generic ways, do people get sick? Now, you ask most people that question, whether they are medics or lay people or anybody, and they will give you an answer that pretty much is represented by this table I'm showing you here. They will say, there's infectious diseases, of course, communicable things, and we're pretty good at eliminating most of those now. Of course, there are exceptions like HIV, but still we're pretty good at it. Then there are genetic diseases that a small proportion of us are unlucky enough to inherit, but if you don't inherit them, you just don't get them. And then there are the chronic, progressive diseases of old age, which everybody gets if they live long enough and they don't die of something else. But those are the three types of disease. And then most people would say that way out in the stratosphere, there's this other fourth category of sickness, which is called aging itself. And people think of aging itself as absolutely nothing to do with disease. It's natural, it's inevitable, it's universal, and it consists of these rather nebulous, non-specific phenomena like frailty and, sarcopenia, which of course is the loss of muscle as we get older, and immunosenescence, the declining function of the immune system. That's the way that people think. Now, I want to stress to you something that you probably already would, if you think about it, agree that you already knew, but nevertheless it's overlooked, and I'm going to explain why it's very important to correct this mistake. The problem with this table is not with the columns. The columns are all correct, but the big black line right here is in the wrong place. It should be over here. That is absolutely critically important. Here's why it's so important. If you put the black line in the wrong place, then what you're doing is two things. First of all, you are trying to say that the things in column 3 are rather similar to the things in column 1. That the diseases of old age are in some sense curable, in the same way that an infection is curable. It's obviously complete bullshit to say that, right? Because the diseases of old age, there's only one reason why a disease can be a disease of old age, which is that it must be a chronic progressive thing that is asymptomatic for a long time and eventually becomes a problem, right? So it's a side effect of being alive, hello? And there's no way in the world that you're going to fix it, eliminate it from the body without eliminating being alive, which would rather defeat the object. So that's not the right way to think about column 3. The other problem with column 3, with regard to the position of that black line, is that it tries to assert a fundamental distinction between column 3 and column 4. And that distinction simply does not exist in biological terms. The only difference between column 3 and column 4 on this table is semantic. The things in column 3 are the aspects of aging that we have, for whatever reason, chosen to give disease-like names to, and the things in column 4 are the ones that we haven't. And that is all. So you may be thinking to yourself already, why is Aubrey belaboring this point so aggressively? I'm going to explain that right now. The reason I am is because it has caused the wasting of a fabulous, astronomical amount of money and effort and thinking and everything like that. Essentially, the mistake that I just described is the motivation for the whole of geriatric medicine. Geriatric medicine, which I'm going to define for the purpose of this talk as simply treating the pathologies of old age as if they were infections, is what I'm showing here. It involves addressing the pathologies of old age directly, trying to eliminate them from the body. And just one momentary look at this simple diagram can tell you that it's obviously never going to work, because these pathologies that geriatric medicine tries to address are being driven by this thing called damage, which, hello, it's continuing to accumulate because metabolism is continuing to occur, right? So clearly, by definition, anything that goes after the consequences of damage is going to become progressively less effective as the person gets older. It's so obvious, it's just embarrassing. But yet, a vast amount of money gets spent in this way. Now, I'm not the first person to point this out, though I may be doing it in somewhat more strident terms than most people do. It's been more than 100 years since a few people started to realize that this was a complete mug's game and it was never going to work, and that the only way that we were actually going to postpone the ill health of old age would be by intervening at an earlier point in the chain of events. And that's where the whole field of gerontology came from. The field of gerontology arose because people noticed that, well, some species, some animals live a lot longer than others. And they just seem to age more slowly. They just accumulate damage more slowly. It's as if they've got cleaner metabolism than other species. And even within a species, there's a certain degree of variation between one individual and another with regard to the rate at which damage accumulates. So that's pretty interesting. And the idea, of course, that arose was, well, hang on, if we can study this, then maybe eventually we'll understand it so well that we'll be able to use that understanding as a way to develop new medicines that will actually, clean up our metabolism and allow us to, even though we're already a long-lived species, allow us to be even more long-lived because we're accumulating damage more slowly than we used to. Great idea, in principle. But in case you hadn't noticed, gerontology, this approach, has also utterly failed to deliver any kind of postponement of the ill health of old age, of the kind that we might like. And that's a bit of a shame, really, because it seemed like a great idea, didn't it, for the last couple of minutes? But unfortunately, yes, this is the problem. As you probably know, metabolism is rather complicated. This, as I'm sure you'll recognize, is a biochemical chart. It's a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works. And, hand up anyone who writes software. Nobody writes software? Okay, yes, you're all medics, yes. All right. People who write software would recognize that this is the ultimate nightmare of what people call uncommented spaghetti code. It's completely uninterpretable and impenetrable, and there is no way in God's earth that we are ever going to be able to tweak this thing to stop it from doing the thing we don't want it to do, which is, of course, the creation of damage. Without at the same time having unintended consequences that stop it from doing things we need it to do to keep us alive. Not going to happen. And of course that's an understatement of the actual problem. The real problem is not so much that this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works. The real problem is that it's a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny subset of the astronomical amount that we don't know about how the body works, even ignoring all the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. So, forget it. Not going to happen. Now, now this is fairly obvious, as you can see, but, gerontologists in the early part of the 20th century were doing their best to see what they could do, and they were fairly optimistic. It took a while. It took them until maybe the 1960s before the field of gerontology became utterly disillusioned and essentially took on board what I've just told you, that this was just never going to work. And that was rather unfortunate, because the result was everyone got fatalist. They basically just decided, well, okay, we're never going to do anything about aging, but let's study it anyway, just to understand it better, as a basic science. It was a bit as though gerontologists had turned into seismologists, seismologists, they understand that the thing they study is bad for you, but they don't have any aspiration to doing anything about it. It's just a case of getting out of the way. This was sad. But then in the 1980s and 1990s, something happened. There were some discoveries made which appeared to contradict what I just told you about the complexity of metabolism. People found that you could mutate just one gene in small, short-lived laboratory organisms, and you could extend their lifespan by a lot, like by a factor of 2 or more. And this was pretty exciting. It was a huge surprise, but it shouldn't have been, because it turned out, and it was established early on, in fact, that the genes in question were genes that were involved in the response to famine, to starvation. And it had been known already for 50 years, since the 1930s, that the response to starvation in mammals, in mice or rats, was an extension of life. They would just live a lot longer than they would if you fed them as much as they would like. So this seemed like a fantastic revelation. It was never really paid much attention to when it was all about starvation itself, because everyone said, well, people don't like to fast, they like to eat, so this is not going to take off. But when it became apparent that one could manipulate this whole system genetically, and now in the more recent years it's been able to, we can do so pharmacologically, the whole thing becomes a lot more attractive as a potential way forward medically. Unfortunately, it's a complete chimera. It's actually not going to happen. And the only reason anyone ever thought it was going to happen is because of, well, I call it cherry picking of it. What? I call it cherry picking of extrapolation. Basically, I mean, like not paying proper objective attention to the details of what we know. The key thing that has been quite scandalously swept under the carpet by far too many of my colleagues is that this whole system of extending life through famine is much, much less powerful in long-lived species than it is in short-lived species. You can actually multiply by a factor of several, like 5, the lifespans of laboratory organisms that only live a few weeks in this kind of way, but you can only multiply a mouse's lifespan by a factor of 1.5. In other words, add 50%. That's still lots, but unfortunately the extrapolation, the correlation extrapolates. So you can get 10% with dogs that live 10 years. You can get maybe 2 or 3% with monkeys that live 25 years. So you'll be lucky if you can get even a year out of humans. And that, I'm not saying that's nothing. I'm not objecting to all of this, but it's extremely important not to get carried away and to think that this might be any kind of fountain of youth, because it won't be. Luckily, however, there is a fountain of youth coming, and it's called the maintenance approach. So this is something where I can start to speak more of your language because, as Peter pointed out, essentially medicine is a subset of engineering. It's all about mechanics, one way or another. It's all about fixing things up. And the maintenance approach is precisely that. Rather than trying to slow down this process where metabolism creates damage, or slow down this process where damage creates pathology, instead, what the maintenance approach seeks to do is to separate those two processes from each other. In other words, to uncouple them, so that even though the damage is being created at the natural rate, it still isn't going to reach any kind of pathogenic level at a natural age. It may, in fact, never reach a pathogenic level if we can fix it thoroughly enough. And, this is, a very simple concept, really. And its advantages are very obvious. First of all, what it says is that we don't really need to understand metabolism in order to implement this approach, because we're not proposing to mess with metabolism. We can leave that horrendous complex network alone and just let it do what it has evolved to do, and we can just fix up the consequences and abrogate the eventual consequences of the consequences, namely the pathology. If we get that to work, then we can sidestep all of our ignorance of metabolism. Similarly, for pathology, there's plenty that still isn't known about what types of damage cause what types of pathology by what mechanisms. But again, we don't need to know much about that. We can get away with our ignorance in that regard, because if we restore the level of damage to a low level, then we know that the pathologies have also been postponed, irrespective of the mechanisms that are intrinsic in this arrow here. All right. Why is this so promising? Well, of course, the natural thing for me to do now is to come back to my original definition of aging and my emphasis on the fact that aging is a phenomenon of physics rather than a phenomenon of biology. It's all about the maintenance that makes this car exist. This car, of course, is 100 years old or more, and it's working every bit as well as when it was built. How come? The answer, of course, is that the people in the car are crazy. And they have chosen to spend plenty of their time doing very comprehensive, periodic, preventative maintenance on this car. And the result is that it's 100 years old. And I want to point out that that's the only reason why it's 100 years old. It was not designed to last more than 10 or 15 years. So now you must ask yourself, well, hang on, how did Henry Ford make so much money out of the concept of planned obsolescence? The answer is because almost everybody is not like these crazy people. Almost all of you are not crazy, you are lazy, and you instead do only the amount of preventative maintenance on your car that the law requires, right? Because you don't care. You're perfectly happy to go and get a new car when your car falls apart. So planned obsolescence succeeded in making Henry Ford a huge amount of money. So that's the point. Preventative maintenance, when it is sufficiently comprehensive, really does work. But now, it's time for me to talk biology, because everything I've said so far, at the end of the day, is conceptual. I have explained, I believe, a very cogent argument for why the maintenance approach is a hell of a lot more promising than the failed approaches of the past to the alleviation of age-related ill health. But what I have not done yet is give you any kind of reason to believe that it's sufficiently easy that we have a chance of actually doing it in the foreseeable future. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to start with answering this question at the bottom. Everything I said first and second sentences here is just what I just told you. The bottom sentence is the point. We, of course, acknowledge that the human body is a massive degree more complex than any man-made machine of any kind. The question then is, how much more complex? And that's, in particular, what we need to ask is, how much more complex is the target, the damage? We don't need, as I said already, to understand how complex the metabolism is, the causes of the damage, and we also don't need to understand the complexity of the consequences of the damage, the pathologies. If we understand the damage itself, we're doing fine. So, it turns out the reason why I got so optimistic about this 15 years or so ago, and why I've been able to convince so many other people in the meantime that this is a reasonable approach, that damage isn't very complicated. There are lots and lots of different types of damage in the body, no question about that. But it turns out that they can all be classified into just 7 major categories, a very manageable number of categories, which are the things listed on the left here. Now, if you look at these categories, you will immediately see that they're very broad. Cell loss, what's that? It's simply cells dying and not being replaced by the division of other cells. So you all know that that happens in a number of places in the body, especially during old age, and the details are different in different tissues. No question, they certainly are different. But still, there's a hell of a lot in common, and that's why the approach to repairing that type of damage, which of course is stem cell therapy, is also, there's a lot in common. Stem cell therapy is a big field because you need subtle differences in the therapy depending on which tissue you're trying to treat, but it's a field because there's an awful lot in common between different stem cell therapies. So the same applies right down this list. Rather than go through them all right now, I'm obviously happy to come back to any of these things in questions, but I just want to emphasize really that we can say the same thing for all of the rest of this list, and that the things on the right, the only problem is they are at a much earlier stage of implementation than stem cell therapy is. Of course, there are many stem cell therapies already in the clinic. We are still a little away from the clinic in pretty much all cases below. But the great news is that this classification does seem to be standing the test of time. I've been challenging my colleagues for maybe 15 years now to try to extend this list, to try to identify some type of damage in the body, some kind of change that metabolism causes progressively over time, which eventually contributes to ill health in old age, and nobody has succeeded. So that's pretty encouraging. This does seem to be, I seem to be getting away with this. The foundation that has been created around this idea, around my work, Sense Research Foundation, we do biomedical research. We have a headquarters in Mountain View, California, which has a few thousand square feet of lab space, and that accounts for a bunch of what we do. We also fund universities and institutes, laboratories there to perform some of the work that we are interested in performing. So we are pretty diverse, but we do it on a ridiculously small budget. We have only $4 million a year to spend, and actually, that's a struggle. So we could totally do with more. I truly believe that if we had even one more digit on that 4 million, if we are up to 40 or 50 million, we would be able to go at least 3 times faster in terms of the development of these therapies. And if you think about the sheer number of lives that are lost worldwide every day collectively from the diseases and disabilities of old age, it's more than 100,000. It's about 110,000 per day. So we're losing a lot of lives by not performing this research as quickly as we could. That's a huge problem. I should emphasize that this is now a very orthodox idea. When I first started to talk about the idea of comprehensive damage repair as an approach to defeating aging, it was not very well received, to be perfectly honest. Most people thought that it was very far-fetched, but after a period of debate and education, the mood has very much changed. This is our scientific advisory board. It consists of absolute world leaders in all of the various areas that we pursue, and they're very much signed up to this concept. And the best of it all is that people are actually now reinventing this whole idea and pretending it's original. This paper came out a couple of years ago, and it's being cited literally once every 2 days ever since it came out, whereas the work that it copied, that happened more than a decade earlier, was pretty much ignored. But I don't really care about that. What I care about is that the concept is now orthodox, and therefore is being pursued by huge numbers of people. Of course, these people, they chose to divide the problem into 9 categories rather than 7, but it's exactly the same idea, a divide and conquer damage repair approach. There are then 9 fixes. Their graphics were better than mine, maybe that's the reason. But the point is, it's really happening. It's really happening, and you guys, as medics, absolutely need to be aware of this before it arrives. If you wait and see, and you just get, blindsided when suddenly it becomes possible to actually make these changes to the way that people age, then you are going to be outrun by your competitors. I should point out that you shouldn't pay attention to what the media say about me, because they say a lot of stuff. I believe that this is a real watershed in medicine, and that when it all works, we will see a consequence in terms of the increase in longevity that far exceeds anything that medicine has achieved in the past. And a lot of people have decided to pick up on that and sensationalize it, but the fact is that doesn't make any difference. This is just medicine. We do medical research just like any other medical research, and that's why we do this work. We're interested in the idea that it would be quite nice if people didn't get sick when they get old. And that's what we want to achieve, people not getting sick when they get old. So we do not work on longevity. But the fact is there will be a big increase in longevity. I won't go into the details, but it's much more than this 30 years that I think the therapies we're working on right now are likely to deliver. The key thing that you're going to be interested in, of course, is how quickly, how soon do I think this is going to actually occur? And I always have to emphasize here that any prediction in time frames for anything that's more than even a couple of years away is, of course, ridiculously speculative, rather like the guy whose cell phone I'm pointing at right. It's very speculative. I don't know. I mean, 50% chance that we're going to get there in, I don't know, 20, 25 years. That would be nice. But the fact is that I know there's at least a 10% chance that we're not going to get this going for 100 years. Because we may very well identify large numbers of new problems that have yet to be identified. That's what happens in technology sometimes. But who gives a damn? A 50% chance is quite enough to be worth fighting for. That's the thing. And I want to draw your special attention to the bottom line here, this last line in red, because it really is the line that defines why you guys professionally, rather than just personally, should be interested. People are going to start making very, very different decisions about how to run their lives and how to spend their money when they begin to anticipate that this kind of thing is going to happen. And that's going to be quite soon. It's not going to require people walking around at the age of 90 and looking as though they're 30. It's going only to require laboratory results that are sufficiently impressive that scientists in general, rather than just scientists who have a loud mouth like me, are able to get on camera and say, yes, this is coming, it's only a matter of time. That, I believe, will happen within the next 5 years with high probability. And if it does, and when it does, everything's going to change pretty much overnight. People are going to want very different pension plans. People are going to want very different life insurance policies and health insurance policies. People are going to be thinking very differently about plastic surgery, about how they look, about everything that really matters to their self-image and their expectations of the rest of their lives. This decade. So you really need to be thinking about this now. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're a non-profit, and the reason we are is because some of this work is still at a pretty early stage. For that reason, we have a fundraising campaign which is focused on delivering clinical trials for as much as possible of the SENSE program within the next 5 years. It started last year, so that's why it's called Project 21. The idea is to have this happen by 2021. And we're doing our best to raise money. But we also have to point out that our goal is not to remain as a non-profit mission. Since we began, like 8 years ago, we have always been very clear that our mission is to create an industry, a rejuvenation biotechnology industry. And what that industry is all about, of course, is the private sector, right? So until a couple of years ago, this was, all I could say when I got on stage was that this is our intention. Luckily now I can go a lot further. I can say that it's actually happening. I'm going to give you a few examples. Icor is a company in upstate New York that was founded by an actual alumnus of ours, someone who used to work for Sense Research Foundation. They have taken on the project that we gestated, which is on macular degeneration, of course the number one cause of blindness in the elderly. I'm sure everyone in the audience is familiar with it. And the thing about macular degeneration is that we can't do much about it yet. But we developed a system of introducing enzymes from bacteria that are able to break down a toxin that accumulates in the retina and causes AMD. And this company has taken that forward. They've got pretty good investment. Just last week, actually, they announced a Series A round, so they are looking for money right now. And they are already doing pretty well. They got quite a lot of seed money last year. So this is what's happening. This is the kind of poster child of the transitioning of these projects from the non-profit world to the private sector as and when they reach a sufficient level of proof of concept. Another example is Covalent, which is a company in Texas that's working on amyloidosis. Turns out to be the number one killer of extremely elderly people. People over the age of 100, 105, this is the number one thing they die of, especially insofar as it attacks the heart. And this group, with our funding, developed a very powerful immunotherapy against this type of amyloid, and they are taking it private in this company. And again, of course, they're a small company, they're looking for money, but they are the future of this kind of thing. Aragos is a company working, founded by someone who used to be our chief operating officer, focusing on organ transplantation. They've developed a radical new system for organ cryopreservation with the ability to actually freeze a solid organ like a kidney or a heart without damaging it so that it can be warmed up again and actually used, which of course completely transforms the whole organ transplantation world. And then there's Ocean, which is a company looking at senescent cells. This actually has significant relevance to plastic surgery because it's been well established over the past few years that senescent cells in fat tissue and in the skin are significantly responsible for the aging of those tissues, and that their elimination using methods that have yet to be translated to the clinic is extremely beneficial, extremely rejuvenating. So this is something that's very much coming. There's a company in the Bay Area named Unity Biotechnology, which is pursuing the kind of first generation approach to this problem, namely the identification of small molecule drugs that can selectively kill senescent cells. There are limitations, we believe, to how far that approach is going to be able to go, but it's going pretty well. Pretty well enough, in fact, that that company was able to raise a 9-digit round, a Series B round, just a month or two ago. So we're talking about proper money here, and this company is doing it doing the job in the way that we think is really going to work, which is genetic, using a technique called suicide gene therapy. So again, there's an awful lot going on there. There's an awful lot more that I could say if I had time, but I think I'd better stop and just mention that I wrote this book, which Peter mentioned at the beginning of the talk. It's several years old now, but it's still current. The reason it's current is not, as I hope I've persuaded you, because there has been no progress. On the contrary, there's been massive progress. The reason this is current still is because the progress is pretty much exactly what we predicted that it would be. So again, this is a case of the concept that we put forward some time ago, very much standing the test of time. The fundamental point I want to make here is that you all know the limitations of what you do as plastic surgeons. You know, ultimately, that the reason why you cannot really make people look as young as they would like to look for as long as they would like to look is because the inside of their bodies is still getting old. And the inside of their bodies, as it gets older, makes it harder and harder to do anything about the outside. You all know that at the end of the day, that is the fundamental limitation of your profession. So I am on your side. You need me to succeed in order for you to succeed. That is really important for you to remember. And there are, if you want to get down to nitty-gritty specific examples of it, like, for example, restoring the elasticity of the skin, that's a really big deal. There's a lot known at the molecular level about why the extracellular matrix becomes less elastic, and there's very little being done to do anything about it. Recycling the extracellular matrix can only do so much. So you need new technologies. Now, we don't actually care too much about the skin because wrinkles don't kill people. But it turns out, well, there's some truth in that, yes. But the thing is, the molecular process that causes wrinkles is the identical same molecular process that causes hypertension by reducing the elasticity of the major arteries. And that sure as hell kills people, and not just in Beverly Hills. So we care about that a lot, and the result was that one of the papers I put up earlier in my list of our recent publications was a publication in Science magazine in which we were able to essentially unlock a 15-year logjam in the research in that area by identifying a way to synthesize large quantities of the particular molecular structure that is the main culprit in terms of age-related cross-linking and age-related loss of elasticity. The result of that is that we are now very close to the development of drugs and enzymes that can eliminate that structure and thereby restore elasticity in the arteries and in the skin. So this is the kind of reason, just for illustration, I could give you many other examples, the kind of reason why people who officially, professionally work in cosmetics, are focused on what people look like, nevertheless need to be paying a lot more attention than you normally do to the work that's going on to improve how people function. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.